Hello and welcome back. This is now episode 6, where we start taking a sectoral view on the impact of climate change on specific sectors of the economy. So, we're going to start with the impact on agriculture and allied sectors. Let us begin. So, just as a reminder, we have so far discussed what is the importance of the topic from the exam perspective. We have covered the basics, what are the key terms involved. We have discussed at a high level what are the major impacts of climate change at a global level and on India. We then developed a framework that we're going to use to study the impact on various sectors. And now from this video onwards, we're going to look at specific sectors, right? So let us now start, like I said, a reminder to this framework, our three-part framework. First, we'll understand the importance of the sector to the economy. Next, we'll see what are the key expected climate-related disruptions or risks that the sector is facing because of climate change. And finally, what are the kinds of policy actions the government is contemplating or implementing to adapt, help the sector adapt, or help the sector mitigate the impact of climate change, right? So when we say adapt, right, or when we say mitigate, basically it is how we reduce the impact of climate change. And when we say adapt, basically if climate change is happening, in what way can we implement new measures or new ways of doing things so that we are able to live with those changes, right? So these are the this is the difference between mitigation and adaptation efforts. So now let us begin with definition of what we mean when we say agriculture and allied sector, right? So of course it means agriculture, the practice of growing food grains and cultivating basically various kinds of grains and crops, right? And then within agriculture we have horticulture, where we grow fruits and vegetables, floriculture, where we grow flowers, forestry, where we use the forest wealth for economic purposes, animal husbandry, where rearing of animals for economic purposes is involved, and finally fisheries, where we rear fish and aquatic animals for economic purposes, right? So these are the various sectors that or the subsectors that basically together combine and form this agriculture and allied sectors, right? So now, as per our framework, first we will understand why or how important this sector is to the Indian economy, right? So it is very important as per the latest periodic labor force survey report of the government. The agriculture sector employs around 45.6% of the workforce as per data for 2019-20, right? And then it contributes a little more than 17.3 of the gross value added in the economy, right? Gross value added is a measure from which we basically estimate how much output is being created in various sectors, right? So gross value added across the economy, if 100 rupees of value is being added, then 17.3 rupees is coming from agriculture and allied sectors. This data is from the latest budget for the first advanced estimates from for the year 2022 and 23. Right. Agriculture and allied sectors are also important earners of foreign exchange for the country. They earn around 12%, almost, right? 11.9% of the export revenue comes from the produce of agriculture and allied sectors, right? Almost a little over 50.4 billion dollars worth foreign exchange was earned through exports of these commodities in 2021 and 22. And then these are the some hard data points. Now, in addition, right, now India is a predominantly rural country, right? The last census was around what, 70-30, that 30% was urban, 70% was rural. Maybe now it's been a while, we couldn't conduct the 21 census due to the COVID pandemic, but maybe it's been a while. So even if we assume that 60% of India is now rural and 40% is urban, but so still a majority of India now still lives in the rural areas, right? And in the rural areas, agriculture is the primary mode of livelihood for most of the people. So agriculture then basically determines the consumer demand for this large part of our population. What does consumer demand mean? So you consume things, right? You buy items of daily use. You buy, let's say, things like more expensive things like mobile phones, televisions, etc. Now, from where you will buy? When you have money, then you will buy. So when agriculture does well, when the crop output is good, when the yields are good, the farmers make more money, and then they spend money on various sectors. Like they'll go and buy various fast-moving consumer goods, for example, biscuits, cold drinks, cosmetics, and they'll buy other items like more expensive mobile phones, televisions, etc. So all these industries then are to a large extent dependent on the demand from the rural consumers, right? And the rural consumers demand is dependent on agriculture. So if agriculture does well, then the rural consumer has more money to spare, and then these industries benefit, right? The second thing is that any commodity, for example, take wheat, right? It's an essential raw material for many industries. The wheat is then processed into various things like your noodles, your biscuits, your pasta, right? The fruits are processed into various kinds of jams, squashes, juice, etc. So any agriculture, sugar cane you use for making sugar, right? Various kinds of beverages and all. So agriculture then forms the basis on which a lot of other industries in the food processing sector, or even like let's say in apparel, fabric, and all also dependent on the well-being of the agricultural sector. And finally, food security, right? Food security of the country, that we should have enough food at affordable rates that people can afford to fulfill their calorific requirements. So you need to feed your population adequately, and you need to provide them enough nutrition to be able to help them live, what do you call, or at least help them like meet this basic necessity of life, right? They should be well fed, and only then you can expect them to contribute to the economy, right? People not being well fed, if people are malnourished, they'll not be able to contribute to the economy. They'll grow, physical growth will be less than ideal, and uh, malnutrition also associated with poorly developed mental faculties, right? So you will have a basically a low quality workforce or low productivity workforce. So if you are not able to ensure good quality and adequate nutrition, then again you will suffer in other areas of the economy as well. So this basically lays out how important agriculture and allied sectors are to the economy, not only in direct ways like employment generation, revenue generation and all, but also indirectly through basic aspects such as food security, and then how they impact the demand for other industries and how they impact the creation of human capital overall in the country, right? So that basically then tells us that this is an extremely important sector, right? Now we move to the second part of our three-part framework. What are the key expected risks or disruptions that this sector can expect as a result of um, basically increasing disruptions from climate change, right? So the Indian Council of Agricultural Research had conducted a study, and it found that almost 90% of India's districts are facing a very high to medium climate risk, right? So basically, ICR runs a program called the National Innovations in Climate Resilient Agriculture, under which this study was undertaken. So this report was published in 2019. It assessed the various districts of the country on 38 different kinds of indicators. Some of the indicators are what is the per capita income in that district, how dependent that district is on rain-fed agriculture, how well developed the financial institutions are, right? All of these things count towards how much risk you can take, right? For example, if an area is very highly dependent on rain-fed agriculture, then if erratic weather event happens and for example a drought happens, then the crop in that area might fail. Similarly, if the per capita income is very low in that area, then that population is highly vulnerable to any sort of disruptions, right? Because it does not have any savings or any income to continue surviving or doing well through an economic shock, right? An economic shock is any sudden change. So all these different kinds of 38 indicators basically measure the climatic vulnerability, economic vulnerability of that area, and then determine how high of a risk it faces from climate change, right? So this is the map for the period 2020 to 2049. This ICAR sorry has published this map, right? Now the districts are graded on this various kinds of risk, right? So from very low to very high, this is the distribution. And as you can see, like districts in green are very few. So basically at a high level, the key takeaway here is that most of India, and it's already here, right, faces quite high risk from climate change, right? Medium to very high climate risk is there for our country. And if we look at numbers, so risk level very low, only 10 districts were found to have very low risk from climate change. 49 were found to have low risk. 204 were found to have medium risk. 201 were found to have high risk, and 109 districts were found to have very high climate risk, right? So as we can see, so you can see this area in Rajasthan, then areas in northeast, UP, this Ladakh district, some parts in Kerala. These are very high, and then high also is reasonably distributed across the country, and then medium, you can see almost all of the country is under some sort of medium level of risk from the impacts of climate change, right? So now, why is this sector so vulnerable to the impact of climate change? So first of all, there is a very high pressure of population on the sector, right? So we've already seen that 45% of the workforce is dependent on the sector, and then we've already discussed anywhere between 60 to 70% of India is still rural, and almost all of that population is dependent on agriculture, right? So therefore, there is very high pressure of population on this sector. So if any untoward event happens that disturbs the equilibrium of this sector, then a very large section of the country's population is going to be impacted. Therefore, it is vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Second is that most of the farmers in India are very small farmers, which having very small size of land holding, right? So almost 85% of land holdings in India are less than 2 hectares in size. So basically, these farmers have very small plots of land on which they are practicing farming, and that means that their output is very low. So most of their output, maybe in many ways, goes towards ensuring that they themselves survive. It's called subsistence, right? So a large part of their output is going towards their consumption needs. So they are able to generate very little additional income by selling their produce in the open market, right? And these small and marginal farmers who are having less than 2 hectares of plots of land basically operate 45% of the net sown area, basically the total cultivated area of the country. So almost 45% of the net sown area is under these small farmers who are very poor, basically, right? So now, because they are poor, we already discussed that they are more vulnerable. They have low income and little savings, in which can help them deal with an economic shock, and therefore they are at a high risk, or in the high risk category, or they have a relatively high risk compared to people who are better off, right? Then large part of the country's area under cultivation is still rain fed. What does that mean? It's basically that irrigation needs are met through rains, right? Whenever crops are planted, then in order to have adequate water for them, we depend quite a bit on the timely occurrence of rains and in adequate quantity, right? So out of almost 18 out of sorry almost 140 million hectares of land that is cultivated in the country, almost 80 million hectares is rain fed. So it is dependent on timely and adequate rains for giving proper water to the crops that are planted. And then this basically contributes almost 40% of the total food grain production. So from a food security perspective also, this is a very what you call critical point, right? So that almost 40% of our food output is dependent on the land that is dependent on rains in order to produce the food crops in adequate quantity. If the rains fail, then what will happen is the outflow from these areas will be very low, or it will not happen at all, right? And then we have very high degree of dependence on the glacier fed rivers of the Himalaya region, right? Even like in areas where the irrigation infrastructure is relatively well developed, ultimately that water is coming from somewhere. That water is either coming from reservoirs that have been created, or that water is coming from the various rivers. And these glacier fed rivers again are going to face the burden or brunt of climate change, because the rate at which glaciers are melting will basically increase, right? So many of these rivers which are currently perennial in nature, they don't dry up even during the peak summer. They might dry up, and during the rainy season, already the volumes of water in those rivers might increase. So then it will be a problem of balancing the water needs with season, right? So when the water in these glacier fed rivers, like the great rivers of Ganges, Yamuna, the Jhelum, Satluj system of Punjab, and Brahmaputra river that supplies water to large part of the northeast of the country. So all these rivers, when they get impacted, the glaciers that are feeding the water to these rivers, they start melting at a rapid rate and receding. The quantity of water in these rivers is going to reduce, and then a large section of population will feel the impact of this as well. And agriculture consequently will also feel, because again agriculture is dependent to a large extent on these rivers, right? So these are the key reasons why the agriculture sector is very highly vulnerable to any impact of or any change arising out of whatever we are experiencing in the undergoing or the process of climate change that is underway. And then finally, we have a large livestock population, right? So that livestock again needs water, needs fodder, right? So that again is going to be impacted when the availability of water is limited and fodder becomes again more expensive and limited in supply. So these are the key reasons why we fear that agriculture is at high risk from climate change. Now, what are the major expected ways in which this sector will be impacted? So first of all, what will happen to the crops? So kharif crops that are planted in the rainy season or the summer season will be impacted by variance in rainfall. So in earlier videos, we have seen how climate change will lead to rainfalls becoming more erratic, right? The fear is that the monsoon season for India will become more concentrated, or and the intensity of very high rainfall days will increase. Right now the monsoon period rains are spread over a few months, and we get uniform or fairly well distributed pattern of rain. But what is feared is that this rainy season will either become concentrated or become more erratic, where we'll get very few days rainfall will be concentrated on very few days. So then basically this pattern of long established pattern on the basis of which our cropping patterns have evolved through history will get disturbed, right? And the basically the crops then will suffer, right? Because at any time, if you plant a wheat crop or you plant a rice crop, right? In the kharif season, you'll plant the rice crop. So you'll plant it keeping in mind that rains will happen at this time, and the wheat rice crop will then accordingly grow along with the evolution of the rainy season. But now, if your basic assumption of how much rain will happen at which time fails, then how are you going to change the cropping decision is going to be a major determinant in how much of the output will be impacted, right? And if rains become highly erratic, then how much of your behavior can you adapt again remains to be seen. So the kharif crops, which are mostly dependent on rainfall, will be impacted by the variance in rainfall. And the rabi crops, which are planted in winter, will be impacted by higher temperatures, right? So crops like wheat, which are rabi crops generally, and they again, because of global warming, we are seeing already that winters are becoming less cold and daytime temperatures are quite high. So these crops will be impacted by higher temperatures, which will impact their yields. So by season, this will be the key factor impacting the major two seasons of India, which are kharif and rabi. Then on the yields of some important crops, if we look, what are the expected outcomes? So basically, what are we expecting that climate change will lead to? It will lead to a warmer climate, obviously, right? It will lead to drier conditions because climate will warm, so moisture available in the atmosphere will be less. Rainfall will become erratic. So what will happen is the yields of most of the crops are expected to decline, right? So output will decline overall unless we can find ways to offset the impact. So if we talk of specific crops, then rice yield is expected to decline by anywhere between 2 and 2.5 to 10%. Wheat yield is expected to decline by anywhere from 6 to 25%. And maize yield is estimated to decline by anywhere from 18 to 23%. So these are two major crops, right? These are two major food crops for the country. And you can see that particularly for wheat, we are expecting a huge decline in the yield of this crop. Then some crops like chickpeas and other pulses, their yields are expected to increase because the climate conditions will favor their growth a little more, right? But even like for important cash crops such as tea, which requires again very friendly climate conditions. Coffee again requires very friendly climate conditions, very low rainfall, shady, moderate temperatures and all. Then rubber, sugarcane, which requires a lot of rainfall, a lot of water, etc. So all these crops are expected to witness a fall in yields. So broadly, as you can see, for most crops, what we'll experience most likely is that their yields will decline. And then we will obviously then have to factor how we handle the economic consequences, because your output is going to decline. So the farmer's income will decline. And then like we discussed when talking about how this sector is important. So farmer's income declines. So farmer has less money to spare, right? And the industries that depend on the farmer's demand, they will suffer. But more importantly, as we saw, the farmers in our country are mostly small and marginal farmers. So if they have even less output, how are they going to continue surviving? It might become a key question for us, right? So it's a very, very critical point. Now we've seen the impact on crops. Now what will happen to the livestock? As we saw, we have quite a large population of livestock in the country. So what will happen now? Water will become scarce, right? Shelter might become scarce because of things like floods and droughts, right? Energy will need. So you might have seen videos already, farmers who rear cattle or who keep cows, etc. They're installing huge fans to like help the cows cope with heat, right? So if such things become more common, from where are you going to get the energy to maintain adequate temperature for your livestock, right? All these things are going to like occur. We are going to see all these phenomena coming into play. And then output of the dairy animals, so the milk that we get is also expected to decline when the temperatures keep increasing. And various cattle breeds will face the risk of heat stroke, right? When the temperature is very high, then their bodies will then not be able to cope. We also get, like human beings also, if we go out in very high heat, then our body gets dehydrated and excuse me, we're not able to function properly, right? So cattle also then, when the um, ambient temperature becomes beyond the biological tolerance limit, the cattle also will start displaying these symptoms. And then like we discussed, that one of the major feared consequences of climate change is that we'll see higher frequency of natural disasters such as droughts and floods, and right, erratic rainfall, more intense climate events like cyclones and all, right? So what will happen because of all this is that we'll see a lot of displacement, right? So farmers who are living in coastal areas will get impacted by rising sea levels, and their places of residence or their farms might get flooded, or rains might flood their fields. Droughts might occur, forcing them to go to other areas in search of food or water for themselves and their cattle, etc. When the disasters strike, cattle and all will face more morbidity, right? More cases of being hit by various kinds of disease, and also more death. So livestock again is a important economic asset for the farmer. So they might witness huge economic losses as the livestock is impacted by these factors, right? And then we'll see more flooding, so it will lead to spread of more kinds of diseases among the livestock, right? So no good news here, sadly. So uh, what will happen, like even now we see when a city floods and water spreads, then various kinds of pathogens, bacteria then come into contact with people who have to wade through the water, and they get various kinds of skin diseases now, right? So the cattle is also like similarly going to be exposed, and various pathogens, various kinds of disease causing organisms are going to come into contact with these cattle and infect them with various kinds of diseases, again which will lead to costs in terms of morbidity and mortality, as well as reduced output, etc., right? And finally, nutrition will become more expensive, right? So fodder will become more expensive. In general, we'll see the yields of crops decline, right? So fodder comes from basically those crops. So then the fodder also will become more expensive, right? Because again, if we have more droughts or more extreme events, weather events in general, then everything then becomes scarce and therefore becomes more expensive. If the supply decreases, then the prices obviously will increase, assuming that. So how will the sectors related to the major main agricultural sector be impacted? Let's first look at forests, right? So it will impact forests adversely. Our current forests have evolved as per the climate distribution of the earth, right? So in tropics you get tropical forests, if you go higher you get temperate forests, and so on, right? But as temperature increases, all these trees that have grown through centuries, all these forests that have grown through centuries are going to witness higher temperatures, and they are not going to be able to survive, or these conditions are not going to be friendly to the kind of trees that are currently in these geographic zones, right? And also we'll see more forest fires because again of drier climate or drier environment and all, and higher temperatures. And generally, as forests face unfriendly conditions, we'll see loss of income from forest produce, because again the forests themselves will be struggling to cope with the changing climate, and we'll see large scale loss of biodiversity, right? So the number of species in the forest is expected to decline quite sharply. And then another thing is we'll see increasing impact to human life and property, or threat. What is happening as forests are receding, then the organisms that are living in these forests will come in contact with human habitations that are on the boundaries or edges of these forests, right? So a lot of times we must be reading news that a tiger or a cheetah, not a cheetah, a tiger came or a leopard came into some village and attacked the cattle or attacked some people and all that, right? So these sort of situations will increase in frequency, or elephants entering into habitations, etc. So anyway, we are like undertaking deforestation. In addition, when these species are threatened with the loss of their habitat, they will also look for some solace or alternative places to like go and stay, right? And then they will come in contact with humans, and that will pose a threat to human life and property. So increasing man-animal conflict will witness. Then we talk of fishing and aquaculture. Then again in this sector as well, output is going to be lower. I'm smiling because I have no good news to give you, sadly, right? So the output of fishing and aquaculture is also going to be reduced because oceans will warm, right? So warmer waters will not be conducive to specific species. Same story, right? In different temperatures on different kind of species have evolved, and suddenly they'll be faced with higher or warmer waters. So then they'll like face extinction, right? Because they won't have anywhere to go, right? They won't have colder waters to migrate to because everywhere the water temperature is going to increase, right? Salinity is going to increase as a result of increasing temperatures. And again, species that are freshwater species, for example, will face problems. And even species which have adapted to a certain level of salinity in the ocean waters will find it difficult to continue or adapt to higher salinity in the ocean waters. And then seawater will move higher, right? Sea levels will rise, saline water will increase. So saline water will mingle more with fresh water. So freshwater species again will find problems in continuing to live in the areas where traditionally these species are bred. So again, fishermen in coastal areas or like wherever we are breeding aquatic animals, like all these sectors are also going to be impacted in a bad way. Then finally, what will be the impact on the workforce, right? So now what is going to happen? We are going to see very hot and humid conditions. So the fear is that these conditions are going to become hazardous. It is going to become dangerous to work outdoors during certain times of the day, right? You will be putting your life at risk by working outdoors, right? So there was a recent study that basically says that India could be like the worst impacted country by this change or this climate change induced outcome, right? And India could lose around 100 billion work hours if the average increase in temperatures is around 2 degrees Celsius from the in the pre-industrial levels, right? And if this is 4 degrees Celsius, then we could lose 259 billion work hours. And India is likely to be the country that is the worst affected by this phenomenon, right? So China is going to be the second most impacted country, and our losses are estimated to be 4 times as much as China's under each scenario, right? And we've seen agriculture employs around 45% of the workforce. That comes to anywhere around 23 crore people working, right? And obviously majority of these people work outdoors, right? They are either farmers or they are like performing some sort of manual labor, carrying agricultural goods or sitting in mandis and selling and all that, right? So most of these professions are outdoors, right? And outdoor work is likely to become hazardous, right? So these people are going to face a very difficult choice in terms of whether to go out and work or whether to stay indoors and struggle for livelihood. Because again, most of these people are very poor. They can't afford to work from home, right? They can't they You can't sit at home and like grow a crop, right? So how we cope with this is going to be a major challenge in the days to come for our country at large. Right now, again, going back to this map, we saw this map where 90% of the districts are facing medium to very high climate risk. Now, another map of per capita income. Now you can see that the per capita income of less than 15,000 rupees, this is annual, right? This per capita income of less than 15,000 rupees and this very high climate risk. So these scales are inverted. Unfortunately, they should have put it in the same way. But anyway, but you can see in general that there is a high degree of correlation between low incomes and high risk, right? So areas where incomes are low are generally at higher risk. For example, these are the poorest areas in our country, and you can see here risk is quite high, right? Very high to high, and some part medium. So going back to the point that I had made initially, right? If you have a low income, then your ability to deal with a shock is very limited, and then you will need some sort of state support in order to survive, right? Your very survival will be at risk, right? And you will need a very high level of state support. Take the example of the COVID-19 pandemic also, right? So a large population, right? Almost 80 crore people, more than 80 crore people needed food support, food grains under the from the government under the Jan Kalyan Yojana, right? Because again, they are at a very vulnerable, what do you call, economic situation, right? Even the slightest economic shock can push them into extreme poverty, or at least, make their lives very difficult. So if a large part of the country is at low income, then it perfectly makes sense that a large part of the country is at high risk or medium to high risk from the impacts of climate change. And why I'm talking this here is because I wanted to show you this slide, which basically talks about the composition of the government's expenditure, right? So this data is from the actual expenditure for the year 2021-22, right? So total expenditure of the government for that year was 2,914 crore, right? These are in 1,000 crores, so you can add three zeros and you'll add. So out of that, right, 97 crore or almost 98 crore, 98,000 crore was spent on Narega. Almost 2 lakh 90 crore was spent on food subsidy. Almost 1 lakh 54 crore was 54,000 crore was spent on fertilizer subsidy. And PM Kisan, under which farmers get direct cash support from the government, on this almost 67,000 crore was spent, right? So together almost 6 lakh 7,000 crore rupees were spent on various kinds of support to agrarian households, right? And now we see that 90% of these households, if we assume that agrarian households are uniformly distributed to the country, and we've seen 90% of the country is at medium to high risk, right? So 90% almost of these agrarian households will require even more support, right? So these are 2021-22 actuals. This was again a crisis year. So maybe in the next year it will reduce slightly from 20.8%. Let us say in like extreme optimistic scenario, if it goes to 15%. Right. Even then, a substantial part of the government's expense is going towards providing support of various kinds to agrarian households. And remember that in a crisis year, this is not the sector that only that is going to be impacted, right? Urban areas are also going to be impacted. So from where we are going to find the resources to continue supporting is also going to be a major challenge as we go into the crisis, right? And the crisis is coming. Climate change is already happening, and in the coming years we will face this more intensely, right? So this we're talking about the economic impact, right? So what, without talking money, you can't really talk about the economic impact. So the government already, which is spending 21% on supporting agrarian households in one way or the other, from where it is going to find more money if they need more support is again going to be something that we'll have to like look out for, right? So pretty bleak picture, right? So now what is being done, we'll discuss that and we'll close this video. So what are the important initiatives that we are already trying to like implement to address the impact, right? So there is something called the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, which is part of this National Action Plan on Climate Change. We'll talk about the National Action Plan on Climate Change in more detail in a subsequent videos. But this plan was launched in 2008, and under this National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, the focus is on enhancing food security by making agriculture more productive, sustainable, remunerative, and climate resilient. So climate resilience is one of the focus areas of this National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture. What are the key targets? So aim is to bring more 20 lakh hectares of area under organic farming. Organic farming basically reduces need for chemicals, right? And chemical fertilizers basically again contribute to increasing emissions from agriculture. right? So agriculture is going to be impacted by climate change, but agriculture is also a major contributor of emissions, right? So if we reduce our dependence on chemical fertilizers, will make like agriculture more what do you call the will reduce the emissions from agriculture, also will increase the sustainability, because then we are reducing reliance on chemicals, etc., right? So we're going to then bring 87 lakh hectares under precision irrigation. What does precision irrigation mean? Basically, we're instead of just indiscriminately flooding the fields with water, we irrigate as per the needs, right? So we reduce water usage also, and we give the plant what it needs, right? So then we basically maximize the efficiency of water, and we hopefully increase the output also, because the plant is not being overfed with water. And then this system for rice intensification is going to be implemented. 2.1 lakh hectares are going to be brought under this. So what is system for rice intensification? Under the traditional method of planting rice, what happens when we go and plant the rice seeds? The field is flooded, right? The field is flooded. So it is highly resource intensive. It requires a lot of water. It requires a lot of chemical fertilizers. And almost 10% of emissions of methane globally are contributed by these paddy fields, right? So under the, because water is standing there and it releases methane gas when the plant is growing, when it's basically undergoing the process of respiration. Under the system of rice intensification, the plants are not the fields are not flooded. The what do you call, the seedlings are planted first in a nursery and then transplanted into the field, and the gap between the plants is wider than the traditional system. The water usage is much lower because the fields are not flooded. Irrigation is given at regular intervals in much lesser quantity of water, using much lesser quantity of water. And generally it uses organic fertilizers, right? It uses organic fertilizers, so that also reduces the emission, because the nitrogen in chemical fertilizers otherwise increases the emission, and nitrogen then contributes to basically the increasing the greenhouse effect. So the system for rice intensification reduces the emissions from the plantation of rice or the cultivation of rice, and it also reduces the resource requirement that rice has. And rice is a major crop for like almost a large section of people, not only in India but across the world, right? Rice is a major staple food staple crop. So the system for rice intensification is more environment friendly way of cultivating rice basically. So we are planning to bring a greater area under this system. And then in the same spirit, more area is planned to be brought under crops that consume less water. Sorry. And finally, basically more also increase the area under cultivation in Arab areas. So reclaim wasteland, and through various reforms and implementing various measures to bring area that is not cultivated but that can be cultivated. So increase the area under cultivation as well. So broadly, basically reduce dependence on chemical fertilizers, implement climate friendly and more sustainable approaches to farming, use or increase cultivation of crops that require less water, and also wherever possible increase the area under cultivation, right? So these are the key targets for the period 2021 to 25 under this National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, right? The next part is basically continuing under this national mission. The Indian Council for Agriculture Research is running a project called the National Innovations on Climate Resilient Agriculture, which is a part of this mission as well, right? And this basically focuses on obviously research, right? How we can make agriculture more resilient to the changing climate. What are the ways in which practices can be modified? The changes that we won't be able to stop. How then we basically live with those changes while minimizing their impact, and so on. How we educate the farmers, how we prepare them to face the changes that are coming. First step is how we understand the risk, right? So that part we've already discussed in the maps that we saw, right? And then out in terms of output, so they have so far developed 7 new varieties of crops of which are considered to be resilient to changing climate. So if we have a warmer climate, less irrigation water available, then how we can develop new breeds of crops that will be able to like grow in these tough conditions, right? And for 650 districts, plans have been developed that in case some event happens, how we are going to respond, right? And technology demonstrations have been conducted where they'll go and talk to farmers. They will educate them on how to deal with the changing climate, right? And lots of workshops and all they keep having, right? So this is the National Innovation on Climate Resilient Agriculture. And finally, so there's been a long video. So finally, there is also a national mission for sustaining the Himalayan ecosystem, which is also the a component of this national action plan on climate change. And here the focus is, like the name says, on the Himalayan ecosystem. So you keep assessing. Their forest wealth is quite what you call critical in the Himalayan system, right? So a lot of our forest wealth is concentrated in the Himalayan areas. So the focus is on basically continuing to assess the health of this overall system, develop policies that ensure that mitigation and adaptation efforts are developed and implemented, right? And also to study these glaciers, right? So as part of this, a Center for Glaciology has been established at the Wadia Institute of Himalayan Geology. And in 12 Himalayan states, climate change centers have been set up, and climate change cells also have been set up to study basically how these states particularly are going to be impacted and develop state specific plans, right? And then India is also working with Switzerland and developing basically capacity to understand how the glaciers are going to be impacted by climate change, and in what way we can hopefully minimize or mitigate the impact. Right. So that basically concludes our video. It's been quite a long one, I agree, but I hope you found it useful. And before we conclude, I'll just quickly undertake a recap of the major themes or topics that we discussed, right? So we saw that the agriculture and sectors allied to agriculture are very, very highly vulnerable to climate change, right? And 90% of districts face medium to very high risk from the changing climate. And basically what we saw is that for most crops, we fear that the yields will decline. And then we also saw that because agriculture has multiple direct and indirect impacts on the economy, any adverse impact on the agricultural sector will have ripple effects, right? Other sectors of the economy will also face the negative consequences if agriculture faces any negative consequence, right? Sorry. And the final one we saw in terms of policy, what is the government doing? So this national mission for sustainable agriculture is being implemented, under which various mitigation and adaptation efforts are being undertaken, right? So this concludes our video on the impact of climate change on agriculture. In the next one, we'll now look at how the construction sector will be impacted. I hope you found this video useful. Again, sorry, it became a little long, but again, hope you found it useful, and I'll see you with the next one pretty soon. Till then, take care and bye.